Jungle.
It is the second Friday of August 2024. Today is the 2nd of August. Welcome to the Morning Momentum. My name is Alfonsoh. This is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. Use the hashtag The Morning Momentum at Younib Media TV at Alfonsoh Albakwekwe. Let's take a look at the top stories making the headlines. We start with the Standard this morning. No sparks as 2.5 billion shillings nominees face test. Now, there were no fireworks as MPs who faced the wrath of Gen Zs for passing the fallen Finance Bill 2024 in protests that forced the dissolution of cabinet sought redemption yesterday during day one of scrutiny of President William Ruto's 5 picks worth a combined net worth of 2.5 billion shillings. That story is beefed up for you on page 2, 3, and 4 of the Standard this morning. On page 4, Kalonzo and Kioni throw weight behind Rigathi Gachagua. You catch up with that on page 4. On page 9, rights group sues over roads levy. That's also another top story making the headlines on the papers this morning. On page 6, Nairobi police boss victim's kin at IPOA. Now, Adamson Bungei among 9 officers questioned by IPOA over protest killings as 14 families who lost kin record statements. That story is beefed up for you on page 6. On the international scene this morning, anger over Hamas chief killing. That story is beefed up for you on page 21. On the sports news, Olympics, Kenya Stars on show. That story is also beefed up for you on the Standard this morning. Let's take a look at page 2. Cartels, graft at Health Ministry will test nerve of Ruto's nominee. Now, CS nominee defends suitability against heavy skepticism from vetting team. Baraza says she will leverage technology and public participation to fight corruption. That story is beefed up for you on page 2. On page 3, police brutality during riots haunts Kindiki. Now, Interior CS nominee pledges during vetting to punish overbearing officers if reappointed. More than 60 people lost their lives, 400 injured during Gen Z protests last month. That story is also beefed up for you on page 3. In matters education, Education CS nominee proposes hybrid model for junior secondary transition. Now, some grade 9 students may be moved to secondary schools as the Ministry of Education addresses the challenges of transitioning to junior secondary schools. Education CS nominee Julius Migosi told the vetting panel yesterday that if approved, he might consider a hybrid system where some students would attend classes in nearby secondary schools. On page 4, Kalonzo and Kioni promised to back Gachagua in event of ouster bid. Now, Wiper leader says they will not be drawn into unnecessary fights. Kioni calls impeachment motion a diversionary tactic in the face of protests. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. On page 5, Kalonzo rejects ODM picks for parliament leadership. Wiper leader says positions belong to Azimio and not ODM. The coalition is set to go for a retreat to discuss the positions. That story is beefed up for you on page 5 of the Standard this morning. Let's move on to page 6. Police bosses, families of protests victims record statements at IPOA. IPOA says it is having difficulties getting witnesses as many fear there could be retribution. The authority says it seeks to have bosses charged for the mistakes of juniors. That story is beefed up for you on page 6. Let's move on and take a look at page 8. Hybrid government birthed by protests, but point clearly missed. Now, Parliament started with vetting 22 candidates to sit in cabinet. Protesters have opposed the recycling of tainted leaders. That story is beefed up for you on page 8. Let's move on and take a look at other stories here on the Standard this morning. We land on page 12, back to pay client 1.8 million shillings for debit card malfunctioning. Now, Mochache claims the malfunction of the card was a breach of contract. The incident caused him physical and emotional pain. That story is beefed up for you on page 12 of The Standard this morning. Let's shift gears and take a look at the expert opinion. Suffering silently and the tragedy of a nation roiled by greed and avarice. Now, I was in that race space called self-care when we retreat from pressure of the world to be by ourselves. In my estimation, I had enough time for grooming, which is rare, followed by a drink in solitude, which is even rarer. You want to catch with more of that on page 13. On page 14, our salvation will come when we know Ruto isn't the enemy. Now, this is on the political chessboard. I know it is not easy, but let us reason together in analyzing what ails Kenya. President William Ruto is elevated as the chief culprit, but our political salvation will begin when we realize that Ruto is not the enemy. Our bane are the systemic weaknesses. You want to catch up with more of those insights by Michael Ndonye on page 14. Let's move on to some other news. Now, the Pulse lovers, you have that article also beefed up for you on The Standard this morning. Let's talk about leadership. Cabinet positions are awarded to individuals, not communities that celebrate such appointments. Now, these are sentiments by Patrick L. Opondi from Migori. He says, and I quote, "My fellow Luos should not celebrate government jobs too much. Jobs are given to individuals who merit, not to a community." Even before their arrival on stage, we had senior Luo ministers and top bureaucrats in government. That story is beefed up for you on page 17. Let's take a look into the world of business. Low food production to trigger increased import bill for region. Now, countries in Eastern and Southern Africa continue to face high cost of living due to food prices. Grain valued at 409 million shillings to be traded following signing of trade contracts by the private sector. That story is beefed up for you on page 19. Let's take a look at the numbers. 13.2 trillion shillings is Africa's total expected food import bill, according to Nega Ubena, head of markets and trade at Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. All right. Let's take a look at funding. Community projects take home 2 million shillings in new LG challenge. Two community projects, one seeking to upgrade the infrastructure of a Kajiado County school and another that will equip physical physiotherapy center in Nairobi's Huruma slums, have been selected as the winners of the 2024 LG Ambassador Challenge, taking home 1 million shillings each to advance their initiatives. More of that on page 19. Let's move on and take a look now at the international news. Calls for revenge at Iran funeral for slain Hamas leader Haniyeh. Now, Islamic Republic's leader Ayatollah Khamenei threatens to harsh punishment for the killing. International community, however, calls for calm and a focus on securing ceasefire in Gaza. In Nigeria, on cost of living, Nigeria beefs up security ahead of hardship protests. Nigerian troops and police tightened security in Lagos and the capital Abuja on Thursday as they prepared for planned protests over the cost of living. Africa's most populous country is struggling with soaring inflation and a sharply devalued naira currency after President Bola Ahmed Tinubu introduced reforms a year ago that aimed to revive the economy. That story is beefed up for you on page 21. Now, with that story from Nigeria, let's move on and take a look at sports news on The Standard this morning. Now, with sports, we start with the Paris Olympics. Kenya's Adhiambo relishes debut in Paris Olympics. Coach Munala heaps praise on hard-hitting Malkia Strikers player. Chumba faces late fitness test ahead of Japan match. That story is beefed up for you on page 28. On page 29, Nabungolo, man with the Midas touch, does it again. Now, St. Joseph Boys Kitale's principal has been instrumental in the growth of football. Cosmas joined St. Anthony's in 2000 before leaving in 2017 for St. Peter's Mumias. Now, in other news, triathlon rising stars today meet for World Tourney. Africa's rising stars are in Kilifi, where they will take part in the World Triathlon African competition that begins today at Bofa Beach Hotel. You want to catch up with more of those insights on page 29. Let's take a look at page 30. Reynolds counting on Budapest experience as 1500 meters battle starts. Now, Timothy Cheruiyot targets another podium place after silver in Tokyo. Ingebrigtsen v. Kerr as rivalry intensifies as Nguse and Komen also among the medal contenders. That story about the Paris Olympics is beefed up for you on page 30. On page 31, still on Paris Olympics. Now, top 10 athletes to watch in 1500 meters. Number 1, Timothy Cheruiyot, Ronald Cheruiyot, Brian Komen, Jacob Ingebrigtsen, Azedine Hubs, and Josh Kerr. Now, in rugby, Gathimba's hopes in race walk shattered. Samuel Gathimba was hoping to write his Olympic story with a medal in the men's 20-kilometer race walk, which was the first athletics event in 2024 Paris Games. But his dreams was shattered yesterday morning after the Commonwealth bronze medalist finished 22nd in the hotly contested men's race walk. That story is beefed up for you on page 31. On the cover page of the Standard this morning, it's a clash of world champions and fastest women in history. Now, world champion Kipyegon set to make Olympic 5,000 meters debut today. 1,500 meters world record holder will face 10,000 meters world record holder Chebet Hassan and Sigi. That story is beefed up for you on page 32. Now, from Paris, we take a quick break. We are coming back with more stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation. See you on the other side of this broadcast.
Hey, wewe ni mfanyabiashara katika sekta ya elimu, afya bora, usafiri ama unamiliki kampuni yoyote ile? Ungependa kupata fursa ya kutangaza biashara yako ili kuwafikia wateja zaidi? Usikonde. Runinga ya Younib inakupa fursa ya kupeperusha matangazo kuhusu bidhaa na huduma unazotoa kwa bei nafuu. Kwa maelezo zaidi, wasiliana nasi kupitia nambari za simu 0750344700 ama kupitia barua pepe marketing@younibtv.com. Jinyakulie leo. Younib TV, ever the best.
Ever the best. Hallelujah.
Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. If you are just joining us, you are rolling with the host with the most. Alfonsoh is my name. Use the hashtag The Morning Momentum at Younib Media TV at Alfonsoh Albakwekwe. Let's take a look at the Daily Nation. Crisis as 32 billion shillings unsold tea hits farmers' payouts. Now, a standoff over state fixed minimum prices at the Mombasa tea auction has left warehouses overflowing with over 100 million kilos of unsold produce with many farms, including the giant Kenya Tea Development Agency, struggling to pay farmers and restoring to loans to offset dues to the growers. And as the tea bonus season beckons, it's a race against time for the authorities to unlock the stalemate and farmers had and cash. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. Now, on page 6 and page 7, how Ruto ministers minted millions in 21 months. Now, we start with Professor Kithure Kindiki, Cabinet Secretary nominee for Interior and National Administration, whose net worth before was 544 million shillings and has now risen to 694 million shillings. Ms. Alice Wahome, Cabinet Secretary nominee for Lands, Public Works, Housing and Urban Development. Net worth before was 218 million shillings and now has risen to 327 million shillings. Ms. Soipan Tuya, Cabinet Secretary nominee for Defense. Previous net worth was 156 million shillings and now it stands at 243 million shillings. Now, Mr. Julius Migos Ogamba, Cabinet Secretary nominee for Education. This is fresh blood, 790 million shillings is his net worth. Dr. Deborah Mlongo Baraza, Cabinet Secretary nominee for Health. Net worth stands at 455 million shillings. Now, 3 Cabinet Secretary nominees named back to the Cabinet by President William Ruto yesterday revealed multi-million shilling increases in their wealth in less than 2 years in office. These are the first batch of 5 nominees faced a tough test before the House Committee. That story is beefed up for you on page 6 and page 7. On page 2 and page 3, airman who escaped 3 executions and lived to tell the coup tale. On the night of August 1st, 1982, Lieutenant Adan Mulata, a Kenya Air Force pilot, and his friend stopped by a pre-wedding event at the sports pavilion in Moi Air Base, Isli. Then all hell broke loose. That story is beefed up for you on page 2 and page 3. Now, let's take a look at page 2. Mulata, Ochuka ordered my execution. On the night of August 1st, 1982, Lieutenant Adan Mulata, an Air Force pilot, and his friends stopped by a pre-wedding event at the sports pavilion in Moi Air Base, Isli. Then all hell broke loose. That story is beefed up for you on page 2. Let's move on to page 3. Airman who escaped 3 executions and lived to tell the tale of a 43-year KDF career. Retired officer was one of those behind the creation of strategic military institutions. Mulata thanks God for being spared by firing squad by the coup organizers after he found himself trapped within the mutinies at the onset of the coup. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Let's take a look at page 4. Farmers' payments hit as tea stocks worth over 3.2 billion shillings remain unsold. Now, 2 tea farms say prices have fallen to unsustainable levels as a result of market saturation. Players in the industry call for destruction of stocks and removal of the minimum guaranteed price. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. On page 5, Senate to be part of IG vetting, Sholei rules. Colleagues tell those objecting to Senate participation that law demands it, and there's precedent. Some MPs sought to exclude Senate, saying holder performs national role. You want to catch up with more of those insights on page 5 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 6 and page 7, Ruto CS nominees face tough test on first day of vetting. Kindiki faced a barrage of questions from members, MPs, who sought explanations over state-sanctioned abductions, violations of human rights and killings of people by the police, the conduct of police during protests, Shakahola deaths, and the bodies in Kware became Professor Kindiki's albatross. That story is beefed up for you on page 6 and page 7 of the Daily Nation this morning. On page 8, the scramble for top ODM positions. Recent proposals to fill parliamentary positions have left a number of party members dissatisfied. Homa Bay Governor Wanga among those interested in deputy party leader seat. That story is beefed up for you on page 8 of the Daily Nation this morning. Moving on swiftly to page 10. Kenya needs you. PS tells youth as over 7,000 graduate from Mount Kenya University. Dr. Inyangala is the chief guest at Mount Kenya University's graduation ceremony in Thika today. Let's move on and take a look at other stories here on page 12. Wamatangi, county officials sue Tatu City for defamation. Farms official held a press briefing in which he accused the governor of extortion. Kiambu boss and real estate company are involved in a fight over release of land for public utilities. That story is covered for you on page 12. Now let's shift gears and take a look at the expert opinion. Clean energy provides a path to a better world. Clean energy isn't a fad or a trend. It's a necessary step in our journey to do a better future. That story is beefed up for you on page 13. Also, empower women in politics. The urgency for women to rise and claim their rightful seats at the political table cannot be overstated. That story on page 13. Now, let's move on. Today on the DN2 Voice article, Wamuchomba, rebel with a cause. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5 of the article. Let's move on swiftly and take a look at the county news. We start with Uasin Gishu County. Blow to victims of overseas studies scam as case stayed. High Court has put off judgment at small claims court that was to be delivered this month. They have sued Governor Jonathan B. and his administration, demanding a refund of their money. That story is beefed up for you on page 19. Briefly, in Kisumu County, regulator lists 8,000 short-stay rentals in 6 months. The Tourism Regulatory Authority has registered 8,000 short-stay rentals, popularly known as Airbnbs, across the country in the past 6 months. Briefly, also in Kajiado County, save your children from harmful cultural practices, parents urged. Now, parents in the county have been urged to keep an eye on their children and protect them from harmful cultural practices as they start their August holidays. The 4-week period has traditionally been marked by a rise in cases of female circumcision, early marriages, and teenage pregnancies. In Nairobi County, poor students in informal settlement gain from learning material donation. Poor learners at St. Michael's Secondary School in South B, Makadara Sub-County, have reason to smile following the donation of educational materials by well-wishers yesterday. In Trans Nzoia County, Devolved Unit Inc.'s partnership deal with Israel to boost health services. The government of Israel has signed a partnership agreement with the county government of Trans Nzoia to boost the health sector through technology and knowledge exchange. All those stories on county news are beefed up for you on page 19. On page 20, Kihika seeks to recoup 8 billion shillings owed by state corporations and private firms. County has hired the services of a debt collector and granted waivers on interest charges. The biggest debtor is Kenya Railways Corporation, which owes the county government 4.32 billion shillings. You want to catch up with more of those insights on page 20. Let's move on and take a look at international news on the Daily Nation this morning. Deif, shadowy Hamas boss behind October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. After October 7th, he was believed to have been directing military operations from the tunnels and back streets of Gaza. Now, briefly, in Arusha, 5 million gain from EAC sanitation project. The East African Community, EAC, said Wednesday that a 3-year water sanitation and hygiene project has benefited over 5 million people across the region. In Mogadishu, AU steps up training on civilian protection. Some 26 African Union Transition Mission in Somalia personnel have completed a 5-day training program on civilian protection in conflict situations. The AU mission said on Wednesday. In Kampala, Uganda, agency announces dates for Uganda polls. Uganda's Electoral Commission on Wednesday released a revised electoral roadmap announcing the date for the 2026 presidential and parliamentary elections. Let's move on and take a look at business news. New power line to slash Uganda imports reliance. Electricity imports from neighbors plug supply gap in Kenya. Transmission line from Takwel to Kitale will ease Western Kenya power woes. The budget cut 109 million of shillings that project suffered in cuts. Now let's take a look at sports news on the Daily Nation this morning. and we start with this right here. Buzz in Kisii ahead of national school games. Top 3 teams in each sport will qualify for the East Africa Secondary Games in Uganda. Talent gallery, over 1,000 students will complete in 6 disciplines. Now, on page 30 and page 31, it's all about the 2024 Paris Olympics. Now, we start with the hunt for elusive 10,000-meter gold continues as Githimba and Cherotich struggle in Paris. Tonight's showstopper will be the men's 10,000 meters, where Kenya will be out to attempt another stab at the gold that has bizarrely eluded the nation since 1968, when Naftali Temu found the top mineral at the Mexico Games. On page 31, South Sudan coach, we are changing a bad narrative through basketball. At the Olympics, when they lined up for the final, South Sudan may have lost their second Group C match of the Paris Olympic Games to the might of defending champions USA on Wednesday, but the young African nation certainly made a major statement about the potential of the game on the continent. That story is beefed up for you on page 31. Let's take a look at the cover page of the Daily Nation this morning. State rejects telcos push for lower power tariffs. Consumers can enjoy lower prices after meeting set conditions. PS tells Senate committee that move would leave a revenue gap of about 20 billion shillings. That story is beefed up for you on the cover page of a Daily Nation. Now, with that story of telcos, we come to an end of today's session of the Morning Momentum. Thank you so much for choosing to stay with Younib TV, particularly the Morning Momentum this morning. We appreciate your time. By extension, we also want to thank all those who made this broadcast a success. Behind the lens, Raphael, Wangila, and the Chief Controller, Anifa, Kavira. See you on Monday, same time, same place. Until then, do have a beautiful weekend. I have been your host, Alfonsoh.